Hey, Joe Gilder here. You doing good? Haha, good. All right, we're going to do some more mix together today. And if you haven't, just real quick, if you don't know what I'm doing, there's a whole series of videos. Check out, go find the playlist if you haven't watched this from the beginning and you want to see this whole process of me mixing a song start to finish. But also, if you want to get the tracks and mix it with me, head over to the link below this video. Go to homestudiocorner.com and you can have the tracks for free. My treat. Take them. Enjoy them. Okay, so last week we dealt with some drum stuff. Pretty happy with it. As I sit and listen, it's okay. It's not super great yet. I've got some ideas. Let's listen. That organ gets a little loud in there, and I've got some ideas for the organ that maybe not today, but I want to distort it and see what happens. I didn't do that in the first time I mixed the song, so who knows? Who knows what's gonna happen? Okay, so if we go back, we've been listening to this one chorus, which I believe it's really important to do the bulk of your initial mixing in one of the bigger choruses, the final chorus of the song, because you get that nice and big, and you can work backwards from there. But if you go to like a verse and you make that sound big, then sometimes when it transitions to the chorus, it doesn't sound big. It doesn't get any bigger. We want it to get bigger, so that's why I like to start there. Plus, that's where most of the instruments are playing, in this mix at least. But I do want to go real quickly to the beginning. Let's say just kind of the first verse. First verse is just one guitar, and that's a challenge. One guitar and a little bit of organ. So it's going to be kind of an up-the-middle sound there, but I want it to be bigger, and I don't think it's super big yet. Okay, so it's cool. It's got that just kind of, I'm gonna play power chords and rock out for a cute few bars. It's cool. I want it to be a little bigger, and the main thing I hear there is the drums, while they sound nice and snappy in the bigger choruses with all the guitars happening, in the verse, I'm not loving it, you know? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. I'm not loving it. I mean, it's okay. I just want something more. I want some beef, you know? It's what's for dinner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go mangle this here room mic a little bit. We're just going to play, see if we can make it disgusting, and then reel it back in and make it awesome. So we spent some time on this just briefly in one of the recent videos, doing this EQ just to get rid of some of the muddiness that was there. I might forego that for a moment. And I'm going to add my favorite plugin of all time. Maybe not of all time. I mean, that's a big statement to say of all time. But one of my favorite plugins that I use a lot for fun things like this. It comes with Studio One Professional. It's called Red Light Distortion. It's a shady name. And it's just a fun distortion plugin that gives me a bunch of different types of distortion. Hard tube, bad tube, good tube, soft tube, transistor, fuzz, and op amp. I usually start with a soft tube. And kind of go from there. So I want to just see what happens when I distort these overheads. Distortion, while it does a lot of things, one of the things that it does is there's an element of compression there. The dynamic range gets totally squashed when you use distortion, which is kind of cool. I like the idea of really slamming a room mic sometimes with compression, but I'd like it to be a little more aggressive. So we're going to try slamming it with distortion instead of compression and we'll just see what happens. So I'm going to open up the EQ on this so I let all the frequencies through and just see kind of what kind of gnarly sounds we can get. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. You could hear it when I took it out. Obviously, it's adding a lot of volume. It's too loud right now, but when I took it out of the drum mix, the drum sounded sterile. Only problem here is Tim likes to hit the cymbals hard, which is fine, but that's coming through on the room mic. So I'm gonna, instead of EQing using this high frequency cut to get the cymbals out, I'm gonna try maybe just EQing it so I have a little more control. So let me do that right now. Yeah, I think that works better than just rolling off all the highs. So I get some of that that buzziness of the distortion coming through in the higher frequencies, which, again, may not work for the mix, but this kind of stuff's super fun to do. One of the interesting things, and this is really important when you deal with something like a distortion plugin. It's an effect, correct? Well, the amount of distortion is it depends on how much signal you feed into it, right? Well, this particular distortion, and you need to test yours, whatever distortion plugins, or if you would like to run it to your pedal board or your guitar amp, whatever you use, you need to test this. But an interesting thing happens. Let me turn off the EQ for a second. When the distortion responds and reacts completely differently depending on what frequencies I send to it. So these frequency controls here actually control how much of the frequencies are going into the distortion. You can tell because when I raise this and roll off some of from the low end, so I'm only sending everything above 240 to the distortion, you can hear it's not distorting as heavily. But when I roll it all the way down and let that kick drum come through, again, this is just the kick drum in the room mics, that all that low frequency energy hits the distortion and adds a lot more kind of thickness to it. So depending on what kind of distortion you want to adjust this to either allow or not allow some of those low frequencies through. Now, if you think that's too much low end and too much top end, that's fine. What I do is EQ after the distortion to get the tone that I want. So that might be a little too beefy. There might be a little too much ringing at 200 hertz, but I was able to get the distortion I want, and then I can just roll off the lows to get it to sound more like I want it to sound. See how I got rid of the really low, but the same higher frequencies of that same hit are exactly the same. So they'll still come through, but I won't have quite the amount of low end down there, which is probably what I want for this. So let's listen to it in context with the rest of the drums. Okay, I kind of like the sound. There's a little bit of low mid, like a whoop, 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 whoop frequency that's coming through that I don't like as much. I'm going to EQ the room while listening to the rest of the drums and find that frequency. It's kind of got a slapback feel. It's enhancing the sound of the room, which I like, but there's a frequency that feels annoying, so I'm going to deal with that. Okay, don't know if you were following what I did there. I added a plugin that lets me take the width of that stereo room track and bring it down. Studio One just gives me a single panner for left and right, so if I want to adjust width, there's a couple different plugins that allow me to do that. I'm using the simple binaural pan plugin, which allows me a width control and a single-click mono button. So that, I think, works better. A lot of the issue and the junk that I was hearing with the room mic, get rid of that EQ, was in the width and the stereo-ness of it. If I bring it down a little more narrow, not completely mono, I didn't think that was necessary, but it makes it a little less obvious. But you can hear, I'm going to play it again, just the drums. Listen to what happens when I click off the room. It changes the whole drum tone entirely. We're getting a big chunk of our drum sound from this now, which is kind of cool. Okay, now I got a new problem. I like the snappiness of the snare that we got in the last video. I'm digging. The thickness of the rooms, I'm digging. But I want a little more thickness out of my snare. I'm gonna try something. Again, this is not, don't have a script. I didn't plan this beforehand. This is really how I mix, and I'm gonna do something interesting. So I'm gonna take this snare track and I'm gonna duplicate it entirely. Okay, so we'll call this SN dupe, snare duplicate. And I'm gonna do something weird with this. So it's still running to the same place. As you can see, it's all running to my snare bus, so none of that routing has changed. But I'm going to do something weird to this snare. I'm going to transpose it down like a fifth, which is 7 half steps. Just a kind of a random choice. It tends to work. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so obviously it's a lower pitch. We've got hi-hat and stuff bleeding through that we don't need. Kind of a cool snare sound, right? Now, by itself, no, but listen to what happens when I add in the top snare. We've given it some more body. Now, when I do this, sometimes there's phase issues that can come into play. Not entirely sure why. I guess because of the different frequency in the processing. So I'm going to put the mix tool on here and invert the polarity just to check and see if one sounds better than the other. Okay, I don't hear much of a difference. I'm going to leave that alone. But now I've got these two feeding into with my snare bottom. So here's my overall snare tone. So we got some beef in there, right? Then we can go into that extra duplicated snare. We can take out some of that ringing if we want to. We can kind of get obnoxious with the EQ because when we add it into the others, we can just blend it in. We'll call this track SN Fat, snare fat. We now have fatness for our snare. Listen to that in the overall drum mix. The snare has gone from kind of weak to still snappy, still going to cut through, but also going to have some more girth to it, especially in this first verse when there's not as much instrumentation happening and it was sounding a little thin and weak, to be honest. I'm going to do that again just for the sake of demonstration. I'm going to hit play with everything in, and then I'm going to turn the snare mic, the fat snare, off. I'm going to get rid of the fat snare and then bring it back in and listen to what a difference it makes in the sound of the overall snare sound. And again, remember, the snare sound is coming from the snare top mic, the snare bottom mic, the amount of snare that's coming in the overheads, and also the room mics. So that's all going to blend together, but this is adding some thickness underneath that we just weren't able to get before, even with some crazy EQ. And you can play around with, I could try a different pitch if I thought a different pitch worked better. For example, I could, let me check, make sure something real quick. Okay, I could take it a full octave down maybe. It's a different frequency. That tends to be a little too low for me. I tend to go here. That's sounding pretty good to me. I'm going to keep it. Let's hear what it sounds like in the mix with everything else. Okay, that was just me messing around with the amount of half steps, taking it down. I tried taking down 5 and 6, 8, 9, 7 actually felt about right. That kind of tends to be where I land. You can get really nerdy and figure out the resonant frequency of the snare and take it down a certain interval. I don't care about all that. Feel free to go nuts if you want. But to me, especially if we go back to our big chorus like before, we've got the same snare sound we always had, still coming through nice and snappy, but now it's got a little bit of thickness to it, which I like. You know, I thought we might get to something cooler like other instruments than drums, but this is what raised its hand today and said, hey, please mess with me. And I'm pretty happy with the sound. This drum sound is coming together pretty cool. When you listen to it by itself, there's a little ringing in there. I don't want to get super anal about the ringing because you don't really hear it in the mix. If I do hear it in the mix and it bothers me, I'll certainly go address it. But I'd like to leave it alone now and call it a day because we've been able to take two things, the room mic and the duplicate snare fat pitched down mic, and come up with something pretty cool. And I'm much more proud of this drum sound than I was of this one. It's all cumulative. Everything you do in mixing builds on what you did before. Now, certainly you can undo things that you've done before, like we undid the room EQ and redid it with distortion, but ultimately it's all building on each other. So the snappiness that we got last week isn't negated by what we did today, but we added to it to get a nice thick snare. All right, that wraps up this week of Mix Together. If you have not started your mix at all or haven't even downloaded your tracks, that's totally fine. I encourage you to head over to homestudiocorner.com/MT. There's a link there to access your tracks, submit your email address, get the tracks, and start mixing along with me. Hope you'll do it. It's a lot of fun, as you can see. I'll see you next week. Bye.